My name is Eleanor Harrington, and at 67 years old, I never imagined my son would betray me like this. After 40 years of marriage to Howard and helping build his construction company from nothing, I sat in our family lawyer's office for the reading of his will. Richard, our son, looked at me with cold eyes I barely recognized. "This is family, Mom. We'll let you know later," he said, asking me to leave. Little did he know, I had the updated will in my purse. To him, I was no longer family. To me, he was no longer the boy I raised. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're viewing from. This family drama might teach us all something about trust and second chances. Howard and I met during our sophomore year at Boston University in 1974. He was studying civil engineering and I was pursuing a business degree. We were young, ambitious, and completely in love. Howard had this infectious enthusiasm about building things that would last generations. I fell for his passion before I even realized I was falling for him. We married in 1977, just after graduation, in a small ceremony with only close family and friends. Howard started working for a local construction company, while I took a job as an administrative assistant at an accounting firm. We saved every penny, living in a tiny one-bedroom apartment, dreaming of the day Howard could start his own business. That day came sooner than we expected. In 1980, with a small loan from my parents and our combined savings, Harrington Construction was born. It was nothing fancy at first, just Howard, 2 employees, and me handling the books from our kitchen table after my regular job. We specialized in residential renovations, building a reputation for quality and reliability. Richard came along in 1982, our firstborn. I can still remember Howard pacing the hospital hallway, then bursting into tears when he held our son for the first time. "He's going to build something even greater than I ever could," Howard whispered. Catherine followed 3 years later, completing our family. Those early years were a beautiful chaos, raising children while growing a business. As the children grew, so did Harrington Construction. By the mid-1990s, we had expanded into commercial projects and employed over 50 people. Howard was the face of the company, the visionary builder everyone respected. But behind the scenes, I managed the finances, negotiated with suppliers, and kept the business running smoothly. We were partners in every sense. Richard took after Howard in many ways, ambitious, determined, with a mind for business. But where Howard was generous and ethical to a fault, Richard developed a harder edge. In college, he studied business administration, always talking about scaling the company, increasing profits, and expanding aggressively. When he joined the business after graduation, Howard was thrilled, but I noticed small concerning signs in how Richard viewed success. During his late 20s, Richard met Pamela at a charity gala. She came from a wealthy family and had aspirations for social prominence. From the beginning, our relationship was strained. She looked at our family business as something to be leveraged, not nurtured. When they married in 2008, Howard built them a beautiful house as a wedding present. I still remember Pamela's barely concealed disappointment that it wasn't in a more prestigious neighborhood. Catherine took a different path. Sensitive and artistic, she moved to Oregon after college to work in environmental conservation. She married a professor named David, and they built a quiet life far from Boston. While we missed having her close, Howard and I respected her choices. She called every Sunday without fail, and we visited when we could. As Howard approached his 60s, the company had grown beyond our wildest dreams. Harrington Construction employed over 300 people and had projects throughout New England. Howard began to consider succession planning, naturally looking to Richard, who had worked in the company for 15 years by then. Howard's health began to decline 5 years ago. What started as occasional fatigue was diagnosed as cardiomyopathy. The doctors advised him to reduce stress and consider stepping back from day-to-day operations. Richard eagerly stepped up, taking on more responsibility, while Howard reluctantly moved into an advisory role. 6 months before Howard passed away, he asked me to join him for a private meeting with Mr. Lawrence, our family lawyer and Howard's longtime friend. Without telling Richard or Catherine, Howard substantially revised his will. The changes reflected his growing concerns about Richard's management style and business decisions. Howard confided in me, "Eleanor, I built this company not just for our family but for all the families who depend on it. I need to protect that legacy. The revised will place controlling interest of the company in my hands, with specific provisions for Catherine and requirements Richard would need to meet before assuming control. Howard knew this would infuriate Richard, but he believed it was necessary. Richard needs time to learn what truly matters, Howard told me. He has the talent but not yet the wisdom to lead. I never expected to need this revised will so soon. Howard passed away peacefully in his sleep 4 months later. As I grieved my partner of 4 decades, I also worried about the storm I knew was coming when the will was read. The first signs that something was changing with Richard appeared about 3 years ago, coinciding with Howard's health decline. Initially, Richard's increased involvement in the company seemed natural and necessary. Howard needed to reduce his workload, and who better than his son to step in? But subtle shifts in Richard's attitude toward me began to emerge. Where Richard had once valued my input on financial matters, he now dismissed my concerns as old-fashioned or too cautious. During board meetings, he would speak over me or deflect my questions with vague responses. "Mom, business has changed since your day," he'd say, despite the fact that I was still actively managing the company's accounts. The dynamics with Pamela worsened as well. She began hosting family dinners that somehow never included me. "Oh, it was just a small gathering for Richard's work colleagues," she would explain afterward, though I later learned that Howard had been invited. When I did attend family events, Pamela would introduce me to her friends as Richard's mother, rather than by my name or as Howard's wife. One Tuesday afternoon, about 2 years ago, I came to the office unexpectedly to drop off some documents Howard had forgotten at home. As I approached Richard's office, I overheard him speaking with Pamela on the phone. "Once Dad steps down completely, we'll restructure everything," he was saying. "The inheritance will give us control, and then we can make the changes we've discussed." I froze outside the door, my hand still raised to knock. Inheritance. The word hung in the air like a threat. Howard was ill but very much alive, yet they were already planning how to spend his legacy. I never mentioned what I overheard to Richard, but I did tell Howard that evening. He listened quietly, sadness deepening the lines around his eyes. "I've noticed changes too," he admitted. "Gerald has been pushing Richard toward aggressive expansion, taking on more debt than we've ever carried." Gerald Watson had been Howard's business partner in the early days, but they had different visions for the company. Howard bought out Gerald's stake in the 1990s, but Gerald remained on the board in a reduced capacity. He had always resented my influence in the company, viewing me as just the wife despite my business degree and decades of financial management. Howard began watching Richard more carefully after our conversation. He invited himself to meetings he would normally have skipped, reviewed contracts more thoroughly, and asked more pointed questions. Richard responded with increasing irritation. "Dad, you need to rest and let me handle this," became his constant refrain. Around this time, Catherine called from Oregon with concerns of her own. "Mom," Richard called asking about my interest in selling my future shares of the company, she told me. "He mentioned something about a buyout plan he's developing. Does Dad know about this?" Howard didn't know, and when confronted, Richard claimed he was simply exploring options for company restructuring. Howard accepted the explanation, but I saw doubt in his eyes. I didn't want to believe my son could be calculating and cold regarding his father's legacy, so I made excuses for him. "He's just eager to prove himself," I told Howard. "He loves you and wants to make you proud." Howard would nod, but as months passed, his worry grew. The most alarming incident occurred at last year's Christmas gathering. Richard had invited several board members, including Gerald, to our home for holiday drinks. I overheard Gerald and Richard in Howard's study, door slightly ajar. "Once the company transitions to you, the first order of business should be selling the waterfront project," Gerald was saying. "The profit margins would be substantial if we cut corners on those environmental regulations Howard's so obsessed with." "My father won't consider it," Richard replied. "But after, well, decisions will be mine to make." The chill that ran through me had nothing to do with the December cold. The waterfront project was Howard's dream, an eco-friendly commercial development that prioritized sustainability over maximum profit. It represented everything he believed in about responsible construction. I told Howard that night, watching grief and disappointment wash over his face. The next morning he called Mr. Lawrence and scheduled a private meeting. It was then that the process of revising the will began. Howard didn't make these changes out of spite or to punish Richard. He did it to protect his life's work and the values the company was built on. "Eleanor," he told me after signing the new documents, "you understand what Harrington Construction really stands for. I'm trusting you to ensure it doesn't lose its soul." In the weeks before Howard passed, Catherine called more frequently, expressing concern about Richard's increasing talk of inevitable changes once he took over. Howard assured her that precautions had been taken, but we kept the details of the updated will between ourselves and Mr. Lawrence. I wanted to believe that when faced with his father's death, Richard would remember the values he'd been raised with. I clung to memories of my little boy who once proudly declared he wanted to build beautiful things like Daddy. But those memories were increasingly at odds with the man Richard had become. Howard passed away on a quiet Sunday morning in April. I had brought him tea and found him peaceful in his sleep, having left this world without pain or struggle. The grief hit me in waves, moments of numbness followed by crushing sadness. 40 years of partnership gone, the space beside me in bed empty, his coffee mug in the cabinet, untouched. Richard took charge of the funeral arrangements almost immediately. By Monday afternoon, he had contacted the funeral home, selected services, and drafted an obituary, all without consulting me. When I suggested changes to include mentions of Howard's charitable work, Richard dismissed them as unnecessary details. "Mom, I've handled everything," he said, his tone suggesting I should be grateful rather than involved. "You're too emotional right now to make these decisions." The funeral was well attended, a testament to how many lives Howard had touched. Business associates, employees, friends, and family gathered to honor him. Richard delivered a eulogy that focused heavily on Howard's business accomplishments but barely mentioned his generosity, integrity, or love for his family. Catherine, who had flown in from Oregon, squeezed my hand throughout the service, her tears falling silently. The day after the funeral, while sorting through Howard's desk at home, I found an envelope marked for Eleanor private. Inside was a letter explaining his decisions regarding the will and expressing his concerns about Richard's direction for the company. Howard wrote of his love for both our children but his worry that Richard had lost sight of what truly mattered. He asked me to be strong in the face of what would likely be Richard's anger, and to remember that his decisions were made out of love for our family and responsibility to our employees. The letter gave me courage for what was to come. The next morning, I called Mr. Lawrence to arrange a private meeting before the official will reading. He agreed, expressing his condolences and assuring me of his support. Richard wasted no time scheduling the will reading, pushing for the earliest possible date. "We need to establish leadership continuity for the company," he explained, though his impatience was palpable. He called daily, asking if I had found any important documents among Howard's things. Pamela's behavior shifted to exaggerated sympathy. She began visiting almost daily, bringing elaborate meals I couldn't eat and asking pointed questions about Howard's final arrangements. "Did he discuss the company with you toward the end?" she would ask, attempting casualness. "Richard is so worried about keeping Howard's legacy intact." My meeting with Mr. Lawrence confirmed what Howard's letter had outlined. The will placed 51% of company shares in my name, with specific conditions for Richard's potential future leadership and protections for Catherine's interests. Mr. Lawrence warned me that Richard would likely contest these provisions. "Howard was very clear about his wishes," he assured me. "We have extensive documentation of his concerns about certain business decisions Richard made during the last 2 years. Howard was of sound mind when these changes were made, and we have medical documentation to support that." Catherine arrived 3 days before the scheduled reading. Initially warm and supportive, her attitude subtly changed after Richard invited her to dinner without me. She returned subdued and slightly distant. "Richard thinks you might be too overwhelmed to handle the business details right now," she mentioned carefully the next morning. "He's concerned about your stress levels." "Did Richard happen to mention his plans for the company?" I asked. Catherine hesitated. "He mentioned potential growth opportunities. expansions that Dad was apparently too conservative to pursue. Her eyes wouldn't meet mine. I realized Richard was working to influence Catherine, likely with promises about her portion of the inheritance. My daughter had always been somewhat intimidated by her brother's forceful personality. Richard would be framing his agenda as honoring Howard's legacy while painting me as too emotional and business inexperienced to understand. The evening before the will reading, I invited my oldest friend Margaret over for tea. After 40 years of friendship, she knew our family dynamics well. Richard has always been charming when he wants something, she observed after hearing my concerns. Howard saw through it eventually. Catherine will too. What if they both turn against me? I asked, voicing my deepest fear. Margaret took my hands in hers. Then you'll stand alone with dignity, honoring what Howard asked of you. But Eleanor, you've been running that company alongside Howard for decades. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't belong at that table. That night, I gathered documentation I thought might be needed. Records of my contributions to the company, notes from meetings where Richard had pushed for questionable decisions, and copies of the financial analyses I had conducted showing the risks of his proposed expansions. As I placed these documents in my bag, I found myself adding a small voice recorder. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state for recordings, something I knew from company legal briefings over the years. I had never imagined using this knowledge in a family context, but something told me to be prepared. Morning arrived with a knot in my stomach and Howard's voice in my heart, urging me forward. I dressed carefully in a suit he had always complimented, applied minimal makeup, and drove myself to the downtown offices of Lawrence and Associates. Whatever happened today, I would face it with the strength Howard always saw in me. The Lawrence and Associates office building stood imposingly against the Boston skyline, its glass exterior reflecting the morning sun. I had visited many times over the years with Howard, but never had the marble lobby felt so cold or the elevator ride so long. Mr. Lawrence's assistant, a kind woman named Barbara who had known Howard and me for 20 years, greeted me with a warm hug. "They're already in the conference room," she whispered, her expression conveying sympathy. "Mr. Lawrence asked me to bring you straight in." As Barbara led me down the hallway, I straightened my shoulders and steadied my breathing. The solid mahogany door opened to reveal Richard, Pamela, Catherine, and Gerald seated around a large table. Mr. Lawrence stood at its head, arranging documents. "Mom, you're late," Richard said by way of greeting. No hug, no inquiry about how I was holding up. Catherine offered a small smile but remained seated beside her brother. "I'm right on time, Richard," I replied, checking my watch. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Gerald Watson, who had no legal reason to be present for a family will reading, nodded curtly. "Eleanor," he acknowledged, not bothering to stand. His presence confirmed my suspicions about his influence over Richard. Mr. Lawrence approached, shaking my hand warmly. "Mrs. Harrington, thank you for joining us. Shall we begin?" I took the empty seat across from Richard and Pamela, directly facing my son. His expression was a carefully composed mask of appropriate grief, but his eyes revealed impatience. Pamela sat beside him, her hand possessively on his arm, designer outfit immaculate despite the somber occasion. Mr. Lawrence had just begun his formal introduction when Richard cleared his throat and interrupted. "Before we start, I think we should address something," he said, looking not at me but at Mr. Lawrence. "This reading involves some complex business matters that might be distressing for my mother so soon after Dad's passing." He turned to me then, his expression a practiced blend of concern and condescension. "Mom, I know how emotional these weeks have been for you. Pamela and I have discussed it, and we think it might be better if you wait outside while we handle the initial business aspects." I stared at my son, momentarily speechless. Catherine looked down at her hands, clearly uncomfortable but silent. "Richard, this is Howard's will reading," Mr. Lawrence began, but Richard cut him off. "This is family, Mom," Richard said firmly, as if Mr. Lawrence hadn't spoken. "We'll let you know later what you need to know. The business discussions might be too technical, and we don't want to burden you." Family. The word hung in the air between us. In Richard's mind, I was no longer included in that definition. 40 years of marriage, decades of working alongside Howard, raising our children, None of that qualified me as family in this context. Gerald nodded in agreement with Richard. Eleanor, you've been through enough. Let the children handle this part. I felt a strange calm settle over me, replacing the initial shock. I reached down and subtly switched on the recorder in my purse before standing. If that's what you think is best, Richard, I said quietly, noting the surprise in his eyes at my lack of protest. He had expected an emotional response, tears or anger that would further justify excluding me. Mr. Lawrence began to object, but I gave him a slight nod, our earlier private meeting allowing me to trust his handling of what would come next. I'll step out for a few minutes, I continued, gathering my purse. Take all the time you need. As I walked toward the door, I heard Pamela murmur to Richard, "That was easier than expected." In the hallway, Barbara immediately approached with concern. "Mrs. Harrington, is everything all right? Would you like some water or coffee?" "Coffee would be lovely, Barbara," I replied, taking a seat in the waiting area where I could still hear the muffled voices from the conference room through my recorder. "And perhaps a notepad." As Barbara bustled away, I focused on the audio coming through my earpiece. The voices were clear enough to understand. "Now that she's gone," Richard was saying, "we can speak freely. Mr. Lawrence, I understand my father made me the primary beneficiary of the company shares. I'd like to discuss how quickly we can execute the transition of leadership." "Actually, Richard," Mr. Lawrence began, but Gerald interrupted. "Lawrence, we've already lined up potential investors interested in the waterfront property once Richard assumes control. Time is of the essence." "Selling the waterfront project?" Catherine's voice surprised. "But that was Dad's passion project. It's an impractical drain on resources," Richard dismissed. "Dad was too sentimental about it. The land alone is worth millions if rezoned for luxury condominiums." "Richard, I should clarify," Mr. Lawrence tried again. "We'll review whatever environmental commitments Dad made," Richard continued. "But most can be legally circumvented. The contractors can be replaced with more cost-effective options." "Those contractors have been with the company for decades," Catherine protested. "Exactly. They're outdated and expensive," Pamela interjected. "The house needs renovations, and Richard deserves compensation for taking on this responsibility." My hand tightened around the coffee cup Barbara had brought. Howard's loyal employees, people whose children I had watched grow up, whose family celebrations we had attended, were outdated and expensive to my son and his wife. "Before we continue, Mr. Lawrence's authoritative voice cut through, "I should inform you that this discussion is premature. We haven't yet read the actual will." "We know the general contents," Richard said dismissively. "Dad left the company to me, with some shares for Catherine and provisions for Mom's living expenses." I heard Catherine ask quietly, "Mom will be taken care of, right?" "Of course," Richard replied smoothly. "She'll keep the house and receive a monthly allowance. She doesn't need anything more. She wouldn't know what to do with it." The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, with Richard outlining his plans for dismantling much of what Howard had built. Listening to my son speak so callously about his father's legacy brought a strange mixture of heartbreak and clarity. This was no longer the boy I had raised but a man whose values had drifted far from our family's foundations. Finally, Mr. Lawrence's voice came through clearly. "I think it's time we invited Eleanor back in and proceeded with the actual reading." Barbara approached me again. "Mr. Lawrence has asked for you to rejoin them, Mrs. Harrington." I switched off the recorder, took a deep breath, and returned to the conference room with my head held high. The atmosphere had shifted. Richard looked confident, almost smug. Pamela was actually smiling. Gerald was checking his watch impatiently. Only Catherine seemed troubled, her eyes meeting mine with a flicker of shame before looking away. "Thank you for your patience, Eleanor," Mr. Lawrence said formally. "Shall we proceed with the reading of Howard Harrington's last will and testament?" I nodded and took my seat, placing my purse carefully on the table beside me. "Yes, please continue, Mr. Lawrence. What happened next would change everything." "Before I begin the formal reading," Mr. Lawrence announced, adjusting his glasses, "I want to clarify that this is the most recent version of Howard Harrington's will, properly executed and notarized 6 months ago, replacing all previous versions." Richard shifted in his seat. 6 months ago? I thought Dad's will was established years ago, with updates after Catherine moved to Oregon. There was a substantial revision, Mr. Lawrence confirmed, his tone neutral but firm. Howard was quite specific about his wishes. Mr. Lawrence began reading. From the first paragraph, it was clear this was not what Richard had expected. Howard began with a personal message expressing his love for his family and his pride in building Harrington Construction, based on principles of quality, integrity, and community responsibility. Then came the provisions that caused Richard's face to drain of color. To my beloved wife Eleanor, who has been my partner in every sense for 40 years, I leave 51% controlling interest in Harrington Construction, with full voting rights and chairperson status on the board of directors. Pamela gasped audibly. Richard's hands clenched into fists on the table. To my daughter Catherine, I leave 24% of company shares, with a board position should she choose to accept it. Catherine's eyes widened in surprise. She had expected some inheritance but not a significant role in the company. To my son Richard, I leave 25% of company shares, with continued employment as Chief Operations Officer, contingent upon performance reviews by the board and adherence to the company's established ethical guidelines and business practices. This can't be right, Richard interrupted, his voice tight with anger. Dad promised me control of the company. I've been running it for the past 2 years while he was ill. Please allow me to finish, Richard, Mr. Lawrence said calmly. He continued reading, outlining specific restrictions on selling company assets, particularly the waterfront project, which was to remain under development according to Howard's original sustainable design plans. The will also contained provisions for profit sharing with long-term employees, and continued funding for the community scholarship program Howard had established years earlier. Additionally, Mr. Lawrence read, I have prepared a separate letter explaining my decisions, which I request be read aloud at this time. He produced an envelope identical to the one I had found in Howard's desk. As Mr. Lawrence read Howard's words, the room fell completely silent. If this letter is being read, I am no longer with you, but my hopes for Harrington Construction remain. This company was built not merely as a business but as a legacy of values. Integrity in our work, respect for our employees, and responsibility to our community. Recent business decisions and proposed strategies have caused me great concern that these foundational principles are at risk. Eleanor has been my trusted partner since the company's inception. Though she has worked largely behind the scenes, her financial acumen, ethical compass, and understanding of our company's true purpose make her the person I trust most to guide Harrington Construction forward. She has earned this position through decades of contribution, not merely by marriage. To Richard, son, you have remarkable talent and ambition, but a successful company requires more than profit margins and growth metrics. It requires heart. The path you've begun to pursue, leveraging excessive debt for rapid expansion, reducing quality for higher margins, and disregarding our environmental commitments, is not sustainable. I hope that under your mother's guidance, you will rediscover the values that make our company truly successful. To Catherine, your perspective and compassion have always brought balance to our family. I encourage you to take an active role, however you see fit, in the company's future. I make these decisions not to control from beyond the grave, but to protect what we've all built together. Eleanor has my complete confidence, and I ask that you respect her leadership as you have respected mine. As Mr. Lawrence folded the letter, Richard exploded. This is absurd, he shouted, standing so abruptly his chair tipped backward. Dad wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. Mom has manipulated this situation. She has no idea how to run a modern construction company. Richard, Catherine admonished, clearly shocked by his outburst. Howard was of completely sound mind, Mr. Lawrence stated firmly. I have signed affidavits from his physicians confirming his mental competence at the time these changes were made. Furthermore, I have documentation of the concerning business decisions he referenced, including unauthorized attempts to sell company assets and misrepresentation of financial projections to the board. Gerald, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. This can be contested. Howard was clearly under undue influence. Mr. Lawrence smiled thinly. You're welcome to try, Mr. Watson. But I should inform you that Howard also left extensive documentation regarding your involvement in pushing for ethically questionable business strategies. I don't believe that would reflect well on you in probate court. I sat quietly throughout this exchange, watching the calculations happening behind Richard's eyes. Pamela was whispering furiously in his ear, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his arm. Catherine turned to me, her expression a mixture of shame and revelation. Mom, I had no idea. Richard told me you weren't interested in the company anymore, that you wanted to step back completely. That was never true, Catherine, I said gently. Your father and I built this company together. It matters to me as much as it did to him. Richard pointed an accusing finger at me. You turned Dad against me. All those private conversations, those mysterious appointments with Lawrence. You poisoned him against me because you couldn't stand to see me succeed where you couldn't. The room fell silent at this accusation. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not just anger but fear. Fear that the power he had anticipated was slipping from his grasp. Fear that his plans with Gerald and Pamela were unraveling. Richard, I said quietly, I have a recording of your conversation from when you asked me to leave the room today. Your plans to sell your father's cherished projects, fire loyal employees, and provide me with a minimal allowance are quite clearly stated. Would you like Mr. Lawrence to hear it? Richard's face paled. You recorded us? That's illegal. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state, Mr. Lawrence interjected. If Eleanor was a party to the recording, it's perfectly legal. I wasn't in the room, I acknowledged. But neither did I consent to being excluded from my husband's will reading. More importantly, Richard, is that really what matters to you right now? Not that you betrayed your father's trust or dismissed 40 years of my work, but whether the evidence is legally admissible. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Richard's face. Catherine was staring at her brother with growing horror as the full reality of his intentions became clear. Mom wouldn't need to record anything if you hadn't tried to push her out, Catherine said softly. What were you thinking, Richard? Gerald stood abruptly. This meeting is clearly descending into family drama. I'll be in touch through my attorney, Lawrence. As he moved toward the door, I found my voice. Gerald, your board position is also revoked in the will. Howard documented your attempts to undermine company policy and pressure Richard toward riskier business practices. Gerald froze, then left without another word. Pamela tugged at Richard's arm. We should go. We need to talk to our lawyer immediately. Richard stood, his face a mask of cold anger. This isn't over, Mom. Dad wasn't thinking clearly, and any court will see that. Richard, I said, feeling an unexpected calm. Your father was thinking more clearly than he had in years. He saw what was happening to his son, to his company, and he acted to protect both. I hope someday you'll understand that. As Richard and Pamela stormed out, Catherine remained seated looking shell-shocked. Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea what Richard was planning. He told me he was honoring Dad's wishes, that you were on board with stepping back. I reached across the table and took her hand. We have a lot to talk about, Catherine. But right now we have a company to protect, your father's legacy, and now ours. Mr. Lawrence gathered his papers, a small smile of satisfaction on his face. Eleanor, Howard would be proud of how you handled this. He knew it wouldn't be easy. It isn't over, I acknowledged, feeling the weight of the challenge ahead. But Howard prepared me for this battle. And I won't be fighting alone. I looked at Catherine, who nodded with new determination. I'm with you, Mom. It's time I came home. The days following the will reading unfolded in a whirlwind of activity and emotion. As Howard had predicted, Richard immediately consulted with attorneys about contesting the will. His legal team sent formal letters challenging Howard's mental competence and alleging my undue influence. Mr. Lawrence assured me these claims had little merit given the extensive documentation Howard had prepared, but the threat of prolonged legal battles loomed. The first order of business was securing the company. The morning after the reading, I arrived at Harrington Construction headquarters earlier than usual. Howard's office, which Richard had begun using during Howard's illness, stood at the end of the executive hallway, its door bearing my husband's name. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked it with the key Howard had always kept on our shared key ring. Inside, the space remained largely as Howard had left it, though Richard had added his own touches. A sleeker desk chair, modern art replacing Howard's photographs of completed projects and their teams. I ran my fingers over the solid oak desk where Howard had signed countless contracts, always with the same careful consideration. Martin Green, our chief financial officer and Howard's friend of 30 years, knocked gently on the open door. His expression was a mixture of sympathy and relief. "Eleanor." He greeted me warmly. "It's good to see you here." "Thank you, Martin," I replied, gesturing for him to enter. "I imagine you've heard about the will." He nodded, closing the door behind him. "Richard called an emergency executive meeting last night. It was contentious. He's claiming Howard wasn't of sound mind when he revised the will." "And what do the executives think?" I asked, bracing myself. Martin's smile was genuine. "Most of us have worked with you for decades, Eleanor. We know how much of this company's success came from your financial guidance. Richard may have convinced some of the newer hires, but the core team stands with you." His words brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Howard worried the transition would be difficult. "Howard was usually right," Martin acknowledged. "But he was right about you too. You're stronger than Richard realizes." We spent the next hour reviewing the company's current projects and financial position. Martin revealed concerning information about decisions Richard had made during Howard's illness. Unauthorized budget cuts to quality control, pressuring project managers to use cheaper materials, and preliminary discussions with developers interested in converting the waterfront project into luxury condominiums. By mid-morning, I had scheduled a company-wide meeting for later that week and initiated a comprehensive audit of all projects and financial decisions made in the previous year. I also changed the access codes to the executive files and formally notified the board of my position as chairperson, as stipulated in Howard's will. Richard arrived at 11, storming into Howard's office without knocking. He stopped short when he saw me seated behind the desk, Martin beside me with open financial reports spread between us. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tie slightly askew, suggesting a hasty departure from his lawyer's office. "Good morning, Richard," I replied calmly. "Martin and I were just reviewing the West Side project budget. There seemed to be some concerning discrepancies." Richard's eyes darted to Martin, who met his gaze steadily. "Mom, this is inappropriate. My lawyers are contesting the will. Until that's resolved, you have no authority to access company records." "Actually," Martin interjected, "as Mr. Lawrence confirmed to our legal department this morning, the will is in effect unless overturned by a court. Eleanor is the majority shareholder and board chair, effective immediately." The color rose in Richard's face. "You're taking her side? After 20 years of working together?" Martin stood, gathering his papers. "I'm supporting Howard's explicit wishes and the company's best interests. We can discuss this further at the executive meeting this afternoon." He nodded respectfully to me before leaving. Alone with my son, I felt the full weight of the rift between us. Richard remained by the door, his posture rigid with anger. "You won't get away with this," he said, his voice low. "Dad built this company for me to lead." "Your father built this company for all of us," I corrected gently. "For our family, for our employees, for the community. He wanted you to lead eventually, Richard, but not at the cost of everything he valued." "Save the sentimental speeches," Richard scoffed. "This is business, not a Hallmark card. Dad was stuck in the past. The company needs to evolve." I studied my son, remembering the enthusiastic boy who had once followed Howard around construction sites, asking endless questions about how buildings stood strong against the elements. Somewhere along the way, that curiosity about building had transformed into an obsession with profit. "Richard, your position at the company remains secure," I assured him. "Howard wanted you to continue as COO, but the changes you've been implementing, cutting quality, pressuring employees, abandoning environmental commitments, those stop now. You'll run this company into the ground," he predicted coldly. "When you do, don't expect me to pick up the pieces." After Richard left, I allowed myself a moment of grief for the relationship that now lay in shambles. But Howard's voice seemed to whisper in my ear, "Stand firm, Ellie. Some things are worth fighting for." The weeks that followed tested my resolve daily. Richard and Pamela launched a social campaign among our friends and business associates, suggesting I was emotionally unstable after Howard's death and incapable of understanding modern business practices. Some longtime acquaintances became awkwardly distant, clearly uncomfortable with being caught in the middle of a family dispute. Catherine, however, proved to be my unexpected champion. She extended her stay in Boston and began attending company meetings, quickly grasping the business issues at stake. Her environmental expertise brought valuable perspective to the waterfront project, which I had recommitted to pursuing according to Howard's original vision. "Mom," Richard showed me the alternative development plans. Catherine told me one evening as we reviewed project documents at the dining room table. They completely disregarded the wetland protection measures Dad incorporated. It would have been an environmental disaster. "Your father believed we could be profitable while still being responsible," I replied. "He never saw those values as being in conflict." The company audit revealed more troubling information. Richard had established a separate consulting firm with Gerald Watson, a clear conflict of interest, which had been charging Harrington Construction excessive fees for unnecessary services. More concerning, preliminary paperwork had been prepared to sell company assets without proper board approval. Armed with this evidence, I called a special board meeting. Richard arrived with his attorney, ready for battle, but fell silent as the audit findings were presented. Several board members who had initially been sympathetic to Richard's position now looked at him with clear disappointment. "These actions constitute a breach of fiduciary duty," Mr. Lawrence stated, attending as company counsel. Howard's concerns about Richard's leadership approach appear to have been well-founded. The board voted unanimously to maintain the current leadership structure as established in Howard's will. Richard was allowed to continue as COO, but with enhanced oversight and restricted financial authority. He left the meeting without speaking to me. Pamela's response came swiftly. She organized a dinner party for several prominent Boston families, conspicuously excluding me but inviting Catherine, who declined in solidarity. The following week, I encountered Pamela at a charity event we both regularly attended. "Eleanor." She greeted me with artificial warmth, air-kissing near my cheek. "How are you holding up? Everyone's been so worried about you taking on such responsibility at such a difficult time." "I appreciate the concern, Pamela," I replied evenly. "But I've been handling the company's finances for 40 years. The responsibility isn't new, just more visible now." Her smile tightened. "Richard is devastated by your lack of trust in him. After all he did taking care of Howard's business while he was ill." "That's what concerns me," I said quietly. "It was never just Howard's business. It was our family's legacy, built on values Richard seems to have forgotten. Values don't pay for private school tuitions or summer homes," she snapped, dropping the pretense. "Richard deserves the company. He's worked for it his entire life. So have I, Pamela. So have many people you've never bothered to know. And the company isn't something to be deserved. It's a responsibility to be earned." Our conversation ended there, but the battle continued. Richard refused to speak to me at company functions, communicating only through formal emails or intermediaries. The strain affected my health. I developed insomnia and lost weight, worrying Catherine. "Mom, maybe we should try family therapy," she suggested one morning, noticing I had barely touched my breakfast. "This division is taking a toll on you." "Richard would never agree," I sighed. "Maybe not yet," she acknowledged. "But he's starting to realize he can't force his way through this. The legal challenges aren't going well for him." She was right. 3 months after the will reading, Richard's lawyers advised him to drop the contest. The documentation Howard had gathered, combined with my recording of Richard's statements at the reading, made his case virtually unwinnable. The most difficult moment came during the first board meeting where Richard attended without protest or attorneys. He presented a comprehensive report on current projects, professionally and without the hostility that had characterized our recent interactions. After the meeting, he approached my office. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, his expression unreadable. "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk, Howard's desk. Richard sat stiffly. "I'm withdrawing the will contest," he stated without preamble. My attorneys advise it's not worth pursuing. I see, I said carefully. I'm glad we can put that particular conflict behind us. A long silence stretched between us. Finally, Richard spoke again. I still think Dad made a mistake. I still believe I could lead this company more effectively, more profitably. I understand that's what you believe, I acknowledged. But, he continued, surprising me, I've been reviewing the quarterly numbers. The waterfront project timeline you insisted on maintaining, it's actually attracting significant positive attention. The sustainability features are drawing premium clients willing to pay more for green certification. It was as close to an admission of error as I was likely to get from my proud son. Your father understood that doing the right thing often makes good business sense too, even if the connection isn't immediately obvious, I offered. Richard nodded once, then stood to leave. At the door he paused. Catherine mentioned Thanksgiving is next week. Pamela and we could come. If the invitation still stands. The olive branch was small, conditional, and fragile. But it was something. Dinner is at 4, I told him. The invitation has always stood, Richard. As he left, I felt some of the weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead remained challenging, but for the first time since Howard's death, I allowed myself to hope that our family might eventually heal alongside the company we'd built. 1 year after Howard's passing, I stood at the podium during the annual company meeting, surveying the faces before me. Employees from every department filled the conference center, construction crews in their work boots alongside office staff and executives in business attire. The diversity of the audience reflected Howard's belief that every person who contributed to Harrington Construction deserved recognition. When Howard and I started this company 41 years ago, we worked from our kitchen table with a small loan, big dreams, and a shared commitment to building something meaningful. Today, as we celebrate another successful year, I see that same spirit throughout this room. The past 12 months have been transformative, both for the company and for our family. The waterfront project, now nearing completion, had become a showcase for sustainable commercial development. Industry publications featured it prominently, and advanced leasing had exceeded projections, vindicating Howard's vision. Richard sat in the front row, his expression thoughtful. Our relationship had evolved gradually from open hostility to cautious professional respect. The healing began in earnest 3 months after our confrontation when Richard requested a private meeting. I found Dad's original sketches for the waterfront project, he had told me, spreading weathered papers across the conference table. His notes about creating a building that worked with the environment instead of against it. I never really understood how much it meant to him until I read them. That conversation marked the beginning of a slow reconciliation. Richard would never be the son he had been before ambition and Pamela's influence changed him, but he was finding his way back to the values Howard had tried to instill. Catherine had surprised us all by relocating permanently to Boston, accepting the board position outlined in Howard's will. Her environmental expertise proved invaluable for the company's new direction, and she spearheaded an initiative to incorporate sustainable practices across all Harrington projects. Our commitment to quality remains unwavering, I continued in my address, but this year has also seen Harrington Construction embrace innovation. The solar integration techniques developed for the waterfront project are now being implemented in 3 additional developments, reducing energy costs for our clients and environmental impact for our community. From my position at the podium, I could see Martin Green nodding approvingly. He had been my steadfast ally through the transition, providing historical context when needed, and supporting my leadership publicly and privately. Several other executives who had initially questioned a widow's ability to lead had become respectful colleagues as they witnessed the company's continued success under my guidance. Pamela sat beside Richard, her smile fixed and formal. Our relationship remained strained, but she had gradually accepted the new reality. The turning point came during a particularly difficult family dinner when Richard finally confronted her about her treatment of me. "Mom isn't going anywhere, Pamela," he had stated firmly. "She's earned her place at Harrington Construction, and she's still my mother. We need to find a way forward." After the annual meeting, we gathered for the company reception. As I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and discussing future projects, I found myself beside Howard's protege, James Martinez. Howard had hired James fresh out of engineering school 15 years earlier, mentoring him personally. Mrs. Harrington, James greeted me warmly. The announcement about the employee ownership program is generating a lot of excitement. The program had been my idea, allowing long-term employees to purchase company shares at preferred rates, giving them literal ownership in Harrington Construction's success. Howard would have loved it. I believe people work differently when they're building something for themselves, not just for a paycheck, I told him. That's what Mr. Harrington always said, James nodded. He'd be proud of how you've honored his vision while moving the company forward. Later that evening, Catherine, Richard, and I gathered at home for a private dinner. Richard had asked to bring his daughter Grace, now 7 years old, and the spitting image of Howard around the eyes. As we shared memories of Howard over dessert, Grace looked up from her ice cream. Grandma, Dad says Grandpa built big buildings, but you kept them from falling down. Is that true? Richard looked embarrassed, but I laughed genuinely. That's a pretty good description, Grace. Your grandfather had wonderful ideas, and my job was to make sure they were practical. Like a team, Grace nodded seriously. Exactly like a team, I agreed, catching Richard's eye across the table. For the first time in over a year, he held my gaze without defensiveness. After putting Grace to bed in what had once been Richard's childhood room, we gathered in the living room. Catherine poured wine while Richard stared thoughtfully at Howard's photograph on the mantel. I've been thinking about something Dad used to say, Richard began hesitantly. A building is only as good as its foundation. I didn't really understand what he meant beyond the obvious. And now? I prompted gently. Now I see he was talking about values, not just concrete, Richard admitted. The foundation of everything he built, the company, our family, was integrity. When I started compromising on that, we all lost our way sometimes, Catherine interjected kindly. Even Dad. The difference is that Howard recognized when he made mistakes and worked to correct them, I added. That's the hardest lesson to learn in business and in life. Richard nodded slowly. I'm trying, Mom. I don't always agree with your decisions for the company, but I'm trying to understand the principles behind them. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was honest. A solid foundation upon which we could perhaps rebuild our relationship. The company continued to evolve over the next year. I implemented Howard's long-term succession plan, which included leadership training for promising employees and gradually transitioning day-to-day operations to a carefully selected executive team. Richard remained as COO. His authority restored incrementally as he demonstrated renewed commitment to the company's values. Rather than selling to outside investors as Richard had once planned, we expanded employee ownership, ensuring Harrington Construction would remain true to its founding principles, even as leadership eventually changed. Catherine developed an environmental compliance department that became a model for the industry. As for me, I found unexpected fulfillment in my new public role. The business community that had once viewed me as merely Howard's wife now sought my advice on sustainable growth strategies and ethical business practices. I established a mentorship program for women in construction and development, sharing the knowledge I had acquired over decades. Most precious to me, however, was the time spent with Grace. Unlike her parents, she had no preconceptions about what a grandmother should be or do. To her, it was perfectly normal that Grandma ran a construction company and knew how to read blueprints. Through her eyes, I saw the legacy Howard and I had truly created. Not just buildings or profits, but values that could endure for generations. On the second anniversary of Howard's passing, I visited his grave alone, placing fresh flowers beside his headstone. You were right, Howard, I said softly, the spring breeze carrying my words. It wasn't easy, but it was worth fighting for. The company is strong. Our family is healing. And I discovered strengths I never knew I had. In the silence that followed, I felt Howard's presence as clearly as if he stood beside me. Not in grief or longing, but in the profound certainty that love continues beyond loss, that values outlast individuals, and that sometimes what seems like an ending is actually a new beginning. As I look back on this journey from betrayal to reconciliation, I understand now what family truly means. It isn't defined by blood alone, or by legal documents, or even by history. Family is defined by mutual respect, by shared values, and by the willingness to grow together through conflict and pain towards something stronger and more enduring. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated or excluded from something you helped build? How did you respond? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this account of standing up for yourself resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and second chances. And remember to share this video with someone who might need encouragement to claim their rightful place at the table. Thank you for listening, and may you find the strength to honor your own worth, even when others fail to see it.